This is third grade detectives, The Clue of the Left-Handed Envelope. I'll be reading chapters 6 and 7 in this video. Chapter 6. Several people raised their hands. Noelle couldn't believe it. She didn't know the answer yet. She held her breath. Put your hands down. I want everyone to think about it for a while. That's what a good police detective would do, Mr. Merlin said. I'll ask you again after we finished reading in our reader. Noelle let out her breath. She hoped Mr. Merlin didn't call on her to read. She had to use that time to think up a question that a good police detective would ask next. Open your readers to page 10, Mr. Merlin said. He looked around the class. Who wants to read first, he asked. Noelle ducked her head. She pretended she was still trying to find page 10. I do, Amberly said. Noelle looked up. Oh no, she thought. Amberly must already know the next question a good police detective would ask. Why would she waste her time reading if she didn't? She'd be thinking about the question instead. Of course, Noelle knew that Amberly liked to show off. Amberly thought she was the best reader in the class. Well, just let Amberly show off, Noelle decided. When reading was over, Noelle would know the question too. Amberly started reading. Noelle started thinking. She thought about everything that Mr. Merlin had told them. She thought about envelopes. She thought about spit. She thought about how Mr. Merlin had licked his flap from left to right. She thought about how she had done the same thing. She took a deep breath and then let it out. Now what, she thought. She wondered. She looked over at Todd. Todd was following along in the reader as Amberly read. Sometimes Noelle was so disappointed in Todd. He should be thinking about the question too. Noelle sighed. Had Todd licked his envelope flap from left to right, she wondered? Suddenly Noelle had an idea. She poked Todd in the ribs. Todd looked up. Show me how you licked your flap, Noelle whispered. Todd rolled his eyes, but he held up a pretend envelope. He licked the flap. Noelle felt her heart skip a beat. Do it again, she whispered. No talking, please, Mr. Merlin said. Noelle turned. Mr. Merlin was staring at her. She pretended to cough. Then she pretended to look at her reader. After a few minutes, Amberly stopped reading. Leon began reading. Noelle was glad. Mr. Merlin had to help him with every other word. He would be too busy pronouncing words for Leon to notice what Noelle was doing. Noelle gave Todd another poke. Lick your flap again, she whispered. Todd rolled his eyes, but he pretended to lick another envelope flap. That's it, Noelle whispered. I know what the question is. Chapter 7. Well, that's enough reading for today, Mr. Merlin finally said. The class put away their readers. Noelle looked over at Amberly. Amberly still had a smile on her face. Somehow, Noelle had to make sure Amberly wasn't the first one to tell Mr. Merlin what the question was. She decided to take a chance. I know the question, Mr. Merlin, Noelle said. Do you want me to tell the class? Amberly jerked her head around to look at Noelle. Then she jumped out of her seat. Her desk almost fell over. I know the question too, Mr. Merlin, she shouted. It's, did a boy or a girl lick the flap of the envelope? Noelle couldn't believe that Amberly had beaten her. She looked over at Mr. Merlin. Oh, please don't make that the question, she pleaded silently. Well, that's a good question, Amberly, Mr. Merlin said, but I'm afraid that's not what a police detective would ask next. He turned to Noelle. What do you think the question is, he asked. Noelle took a deep breath. Here goes, she thought. I think the question is, which side did the person start on when he licked the envelope flap? That's exactly right, Mr. Merlin said. Amberly started crying. What's wrong, Amberly? Mr. Merlin asked. That's what I was going to say next, Amberly sobbed. You didn't give me a chance to finish. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Merlin said. Well, next time, please remind me to give you more time to answer the question. Amberly stopped crying. How can you find out which side the person started on, Todd asked. You unseal the envelope flap scientifically, Mr. Merlin explained. Then you put special chemicals on it. I asked Dr. Smiley to test Amberly's envelope. The flap had more saliva on the right-hand side. It decreased across the arc to the left-hand side. That means whoever licked the envelope flap probably started on the right-hand side and licked to the left-hand side. Mr. Merlin looked around the room. Think about it carefully, he said. Which hand does this person probably use? Amberly raised her hand. He probably uses his left hand, she replied. Right-handed people usually lick envelope flaps from left to right. Left-handed people usually lick envelope flaps from right to left. Excellent, Amberly, Mr. Merlin said. He looked around the room. I'm glad Amberly answered the question. Noelle blinked. Why, she wondered. You'll all accomplish more if you work together, Mr. Merlin explained. That's the way good police detectives do it. Noelle bowed her head. She knew Mr. Merlin was talking about her. She raised her hand. Yes, Noelle, Mr. Merlin said. I think we should all work together too, Noelle said. Amberly gave her a funny look, but she didn't say anything. Mr. Merlin smiled. Well, I'm glad that's settled, he said. Who knows what we have to do next in order to solve the mystery? Todd raised his hand. We have to find someone who's left-handed, he said. Excellent, Mr. Merlin said. That would help you narrow down who might have sent the letter. But it's important to remember that the envelope test isn't always accurate. Sometimes left-handed people start on the left. Sometimes right-handed people start on the right. Sometimes people start in the middle and look to both sides. Most of the time, though, left-handed people start on the right and right-handed people start on the left. Mr. Merlin looked at the clock on the wall. Oh my, he said, we need to do science and spelling before recess. So they spent the next hour learning about crocodiles and words that start with SP. Then the bell for recess rang. We'll do math after recess, Mr. Merlin said. Then we'll talk some more about our mystery. Noelle stood up. I can't stand that Amber Lee, she whispered to Todd. She made Mr. Merlin feel sorry for her. Now I think he wants her to solve the mystery. Todd grinned. How can she solve the mystery if we solve it first?